On the 19th of January 1946, a crowd of thousands of people had gathered inside the capital city of Ukraine, a city which had suffered so much during World War II, and they came to see the executions of 12 former members of the German police force who had terrorised them. The men were taken onto the back of a truck, and they were stood on a huge gallows, which had been created in a public square, and one by one the executioners secured nooses around their necks, and then the trucks were ordered to drive off. But these were not just enemy soldiers who had been sentenced to death. They were some of the most barbaric war criminals of World War II, and they had been involved in the slaughter of over 33,000 people in just 2 days at a site known as Babi Yar. At the ravine near Kiev, around 100,000 to 150,000 were executed and murdered during the Second World War in total, and many of these German police forces were involved in the deaths. And why were executions worse for people to witness and see than they first thought? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The site of Babi Yar during World War II was where thousands were killed. The Germans rampaged in Kyiv and occupied it on the 19th of September 1941, following the launching of Operation Barbarossa months earlier. There was chaos in the city, and explosives were then detonated by Soviet secret police within the city, which damaged the infrastructure and also exploded near German headquarters. With this, revenge and retaliation was ordered against the people of Kiev, and Jewish people were rounded up and were told to gather in a square. They were then led towards Babi Yar, a ravine, with valuables and clothing, and they were then told to leave these items in piles near the ravine. After this, the victims were forced to undress, and they were then marched, where they were then shot by execution squads, and they had to lie on the corpses of those who went before. One eyewitness claimed that, "I watched what happened with the men, women and children as they arrived. The guards led them past a number of different places, where one after the other they had to give up their luggage, then their coats, shoes and overgarments, and also underwear. They also had to leave their valuables in a designated place. There was a special pile for each article of clothing. It all happened very quickly, and anyone who hesitated was kicked or pushed by the men to keep them moving. The victims did not realise what was happening to them, and it was also said, once undressed they were led into the ravine, which was around 150 metres long and 30 metres wide and a good 15 metres deep. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized by members of the Schutzpolizei and made to lie down on top of those who had already been shot. The corpses were literally in layers. A police marksman came along and shot each of them in the neck with a submachine gun. I saw these marksmen standing on layers of corpses and shoot one after the other. The marksman would walk across the bodies of the executed to the next one, who had meanwhile laid down, and shoot him. The corpses were buried under layers of dirt, and in 2 days in September 1941, 33,771 were executed. Over the entire war, it's believed that over 100,000 people from Kiev and surrounding areas were massacred at the Babi Yar ravine. Many of the Germans and Nazis involved in the massacre, such as commander of the Einsatzgruppe, Paul Blobel, were proud of what they'd done. Regarding him, it was claimed that, "We were driving past a long ravine. I noticed strange movements of earth. Clumps of earth rose into the air, as if by their own propulsion, and there was smoke. It was like a low-toned volcano, as if there were burning lava just beneath the earth." Blobel laughed, made a gesture with his arms pointing back along the road and ahead, all along the ravine of Babi Yar, and said, "Here lie my 30,000 Jews." Blobel would be executed inside Landsberg prison for his crimes, and others were rounded up for their involvement. One German who was later brought to trial, Boris Drachenfels, but was not condemned for his actions, explained why Babi Yar was so terrifying. He said, "Screams of thousands of people were heard from far away. They stood surrounded by many policemen and awaited their fate. The policemen drove groups of people to the ditches where they undressed. Special SD details and the policemen of our battalion shot them in the nape of the neck. Adults were forced to lie down in ditches and were shot, while children were torn away from their mothers and shot. Most of the shooters were drunk. People begged for mercy. Mothers begged us to spare their children." At the end of the Second World War, countries which fell under the Soviet Union, such as Ukraine, were desperate to put their enemies to the sword, and Stalin in particular ordered a number of public executions to be carried out. To Stalin, this was a way in which he would gain favour with the populations, showing them that justice against their enemies was being carried out right inside Soviet towns and cities. Even as the Second World War was still going on, prominent Nazi war criminals were executed in public in full view of the people of the Soviet lands. They were happy with this, as they saw the punishments as justified, and in their thousands people flocked to see these executions. In January 1946, 15 former members of the German police force were brought to trial in Kiev in what was a rather predetermined show trial, and there were men involved in the massacre and deaths of thousands of people inside of Ukraine during World War II. The courtroom heard many witnesses and a lot of evidence about the defendants and their crimes. Out of the 15 defendants, there were 12 who were sentenced to death. These were Fritz Beckenhoff, Karl Butschard, George Heinisch, Wilhelm Hellerhoff, Hans Isenmann, Emil Jörgschat, Emil Nöll, Willy Meyer, Paul von Scheer, Eckhard Hans von Schammer und Osten, George Truckenbrod, and Oskar Walliser. The men were all involved in the killing of civilians inside occupied lands, and with this the judges proclaimed their death sentences. On the 29th of January 1946, the condemned men were led out from their prison, and they were taken into the centre of Kiev, and to a town square where a huge set of gallows had been created. The gallows specifically was built to hang the men at the same time, meaning it was so big that 12 bodies could be strung up from it. The wooden beams were thick and heavy, and were held in place by huge nails, and a crowd had been gathered. The crowd were looking on from the hills surrounding the gallows, and they were also gathered in the square. The men were helped onto the back of several trucks which were parked under the gallows, and these were to act as a scaffold, the platform the men had the noose secured on. Also on the truck were Soviet officials, and also the executioners. The death sentences were read out, and one by one the executioners threw the noose over the crossbeams, and they then secured it around the necks of the condemned German men. They were stood on the stool, too, and then the official read out the death sentences. He claimed, for the brutal destruction of peaceful Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, for the destruction of cities and villages, for the enslavement of the population of Soviet Ukraine, guided by Article 2 of the Criminal Code of the Ukraine SSR and Articles 296 and 297 of the Criminal Procedure Code of the Ukraine SSR, the military tribunal sentenced Scheer, Burkhard, Schammer and Osten, Heinisch, Walliser, Truckenbrod, Gellerfoot, Nöll, Beckenroth, Isenmann, Jörgschat to death by hanging. Comrade Commandant enforced the sentence. With this, the trucks were told to drive off, and the 12 men were left hanging from the large gallows. Crowds of dozens of thousands witnessed the men struggle and kick as the nooses snapped taut, and they had the air strangled out of them. It took many minutes for the men to go still, and they were subjected to slow strangulation. There was no snapping of the neck with a drop. After several minutes, the men's bodies went rigid and still, and the crowd then dispersed, seeing the public executions of the men, and over the next few hours, the former German police officers were then cut down. This was just one of a number of public executions that was carried out during the months and years after the end of the Second World War. Inside of Soviet lands, thousands flocked to major cities to witness these sights being carried out, and it was to them revenge for the suffering, and may have offered some form of closure against the events of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.